then why did food prices go up so dramatically over the last year? I've seen a lot of interviews with all these experts, economists, to agriculture, to the food industry, all these experts and supermarkets being interviewed. And I'm really amazed that each of them thinks that, it's their specific sector that has caused food prices to rise. When really they're taking their one, rose-tinted view of the world and thinking that's it. But actually, it's about 3 or 4 main components combined with another 3 or 4 minor components that have caused all of these food prices this year. So number 1 will come as no surprise to any of you, and that is via the central bank purchasing program known as QE, or quantitative easing. And we'll use the Federal Reserve because this is the biggest one and pretty much dictates all the others. But the Federal Reserve has been buying 120 billion with a B assets every single month via their QE program. So they've mainly been buying US treasuries, but they've also been buying the one that worries me the most, which is MBS, mortgage-backed securities. So if you look at the Fed's balance sheet, they now own 53% of all the mortgages in the United States. That is pretty worrying. So what is QE then? This is basically currency creation, new currency creation. The central bank creates QE, and then eventually a lot of this works its way into the economy. A lot of people say, oh, the QE never gets into the economy, etc. That is not accurate. A lot of it does. And this is why I always say, and this is my golden rule, wait 12 to 18 months after each period of QE and you'll see inflation. You'll see these price rises of a lot of goods and services to reflect the QE that was done a year earlier or 18 months earlier. And quantitative easing, or inflation, if you want to say, we'll talk about inflation, is a tax. In a normal economy, it isn't debt-based or credit-based. There shouldn't be inflation. What you should have is deflation. So an example of deflation that you'll know from the last year would be, let's say, airline seats or hotel rooms or leisure and tourism. All of these prices came down because the demand wasn't there. The supply was still there, but the demand shrunk. So prices came down with it. So what happened with food then? Well, the demand was still there, but the supply chain breakdowns occurred quite dramatically, meaning that, well, it wasn't just that. There was a lot of other things with it. Gasoline, so fuel prices, trucking costs, transportation, raw material costs, all these things added to it. Another main component not really being talked about much is that there were a number of droughts in a lot of agriculture-based countries. There were a lot of flooding in other countries as well. And it's quite ironic that one of the biggest countries actually way back at the very start of the COVID crisis went around buying the contracts on the soybeans, the wheat, the grains, etc. And they were buying all these things at very, very cheap prices, buying huge amounts of it and taking delivery. So then what happens is the other countries, or the other Western countries, are then going out into the marketplace to buy, the food supplies, as it were, the raw materials, but now they're paying a much higher price because of all the wastage and the losses that occurred during the last year. Compound this with supply chain breakdowns, and you can see how all this adds up to increased prices in the supermarket or the grocery store. That doesn't take into account all of the stimulus and the unemployment benefits, encouraging people not to come back to work, especially in the lower paid jobs. And you have these shortfalls in the working sector where you can't recruit enough workers to do this sort of work in the supermarkets, the grocery stores, etc. So of course, what do? You have to increase the wages, you have to pay more, the costs get passed on to the customers, etc., etc. And I just touched upon the government stimulus there, but I should probably talk in more detail on that because this helped to push up prices this year. When you have a breakdown in supply chains, so you have less goods and services available, but then you give everyone currency and you directly give it to them so they can go out and spend it right away. You now have more currency chasing less goods and services. Supply and demand, ladies and gentlemen. What do you expect to happen? Prices will just skyrocket. However, now that all of this stimulus is finished and it's not going into the hands of the people, this is now more of a deflationary aspect where that was inflationary. So as the supply chains normalize again and you haven't got all this extra currency just sat around with people in their hands wanting to spend it, you're going to see the food supply chains start to normalize again as we go into the near future. So I guess this brings me on to the next question that everyone's talking about. It's pretty much 50-50 whichever way you go and speak to an expert on this, and that is inflation. Is it transitory? Is it not transitory? Again, it's split right down the middle. I personally believe the reason it's split down the middle and why so many experts are arguing about this is because they're arguing about two completely different things and thinking they're arguing about the same thing. We just talked about the food and some other things there, or let's say commodities and lumber, etc. etc. Once the supply chains normalize again, and I think they will normalize to some degree, at least by 90-95%, I think will normalize. And then you have less currency, or if you want to say money, I prefer to say currency. If then you have less currency chasing these things, you're going to see all of that inflation that people think is just going to keep going. That, in my opinion, will be transitory, and it will normalize again. And prices will normalize, but they won't go back down to where they were before. No, because we have all this new currency. So the inflation will slow down and eventually sort of plateau a little bit, just increasing gradually as time goes by. So that part will be transitory, I believe. But what about some of the other aspects of the inflation? I don't believe these things will be transitory. Once you create all this new currency via quantitative easing and other measures, and you dump it into the supply, you've still got the same number of people, or you might have less people in the future, but you've still got the same number of people, but now you've got more currency. So all this currency is chasing the same amount of goods and services. So do you see where this is going? The prices have to go up as a result. Not all prices will go up, as we mentioned. Some things will be deflationary. Computers, a TV, a camera, things like this. These things over time gradually come down in price, or they sort of stay the same price, but the technology increases. So that again is deflationary in nature. So we will see some deflationary aspects, but we will see some inflationary aspects at the same time. Additionally, as long as we're allowed to continue being a free market economy with capitalism and entrepreneurship, you should see prices come down in time as well. And this includes as well AI and productivity increasing, and all the things I've talked about, like self-service and all these other things. Good in one regard, very bad in another, because it destroys jobs. And people need jobs. If people haven't got jobs, how do they get money? How do they go into the economy and spend money, which then gives the profits to the company to then pay the wages, and then the wages go back. It's a loop. It has to keep going around. Now, when you take all the jobs out of the equation, like seems to be happening at a rapid rate, what you're left with is a lot of people at the lower end of the scale, the lower income workers, shall we say. And I don't mean that in a derogative way in any regard, but the lower income earners, what are they supposed to do? It's creating a very bad environment for these people. And these are the people that need the money the most to be able to go out there and spend it. How are they going to pay for their food and energy bills and mortgage or rent and things like that? These are some of the things that concern me. But obviously, with the increase of entrepreneurship, this should also bring down prices as well, because you now have more suppliers coming into the market. And when you have increased competition, it drives down prices. So this is another aspect that will be deflationary as we go forward. So when I interview experts and they talk about, going into a very high inflation and into a hyperinflation, the reason I always say I just can't see it is because I do look at the velocity of money amongst other metrics as well. And if I can't see any evidence for it there, I think the likelihood is very low. Added to this, as I mentioned to Peter, yes, we've created a ton of new currency in the last year, more than we've ever created in the history of crises. However, and here's the caveat to this, however, we still haven't created as much on a percentage basis as we did during the last financial crisis, 08, what's known as the Great Recession. So I do still think that we're not in a good position right now, but I also don't think we're in a dire straits position. And actually, velocity of money is one of the reasons I believe that the governments around the world want to create a CBDC, a central bank digital currency. There's a lot of reasons they want it: greater control, to stop fraud, and all the other things they say. But I believe it's because they eventually want to cut out all the commercial banks that sit in the middle, and they want to do direct deposits with people and control where the money's spent and things like this. This increases the velocity of money. They can help to increase, they can just do direct deposits for different people. People then go and spend that into the economy. That increases the velocity of money. It creates inflation. Remember, governments and central banks want inflation. If, let's say, the central bank was to increase interest rates by 1 or 2% or 3% today, the government would go bankrupt. In fact, most governments would, right now would go bankrupt. So what do they want instead? They want to, do theft, legalize theft of the people's savings. How do they do that? When they create QE. Because when you create QE, you're expanding the currency supply, but not the amount of goods and services. So what that does, it increases asset prices, housing market, stock market, etc. But what's actually happened to people that have saved money, worked all their life to save money? The currency there hasn't expanded, but the purchasing power has gone down. So that's how they do it. That is how they do this legalized theft of people's money. And this is good for the government because it allows them to inflate away their debts at the expense of the people. So anyone that says that quantitative easing isn't inflationary in nature, I don't know what they're looking at, because you always see the inflation come in terms of price rises 12 to 18 months later on. Always. You can look back as far as you want and you will always see this occurring. So a lot of the inflation we're seeing right now, and this is why I'm saying some's transitory, some's not, a lot of the inflation you're seeing is as a result of last year's quantitative easing printing. So we haven't even seen the rest of last year coming through yet. So we're going to be seeing that coming through. That's obviously inflationary in nature, but we're going to see, supply chains normalize. There isn't the same amount of currency running around with people getting stimulus. So these things will be more deflationary in nature.